At 3:17 in the morning on November the 12th, 1943, Lieutenant William Anderson pressed his face against the plexiglass windscreen of his Consolidated PB4Y-1 Liberator and stared into the darkness 95 miles north of Cape Peñas, Spain. The bomber, nicknamed Calvert and Coke, was flying at 1,500 feet over the Bay of Biscay. The 4 Pratt and Whitney engines droned steadily. The navigator had just marked their position on the chart. The radar operator sat hunched over his ASV Mark Three scope, watching for the distinctive blip that meant a surfaced submarine. Anderson had been flying anti-submarine patrols for 8 months. He knew what to expect. German U-boats crossed the Bay of Biscay constantly, transiting between their concrete bunkers at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and La Rochelle and their hunting grounds in the North Atlantic. They traveled on the surface when they could, running their diesel engines at 14 to 17 knots, covering the 300 miles of open water in 18 to 20 hours. Only submerged could they recharge batteries. Only surfaced could they make decent speed. The radar operator called out, "Contact, bearing 320 degrees, range 12,000 yards. Anderson banked left and pushed the yoke forward. The Liberator descended toward the ocean. 1,000 feet, 800, 500. The airspeed indicator climbed past 180 knots. Anderson could see nothing in the darkness ahead, just black water and spray. At 3,000 yards, the radar operator lost contact. The submarine had crash-dived. The German commander had spotted them somehow, perhaps visually against the stars, perhaps with his own radar detector. The U-boat was going deep, flooding ballast tanks, angling down at 30 degrees, trying to reach 200 feet where Allied depth charges would have trouble reaching. Anderson knew he had perhaps 45 seconds before the submarine disappeared completely. He had to make an instantaneous decision based on fragmentary information and 8 months of training that was about to be tested in ways nobody had anticipated. What happened in the next 30 seconds would determine whether this U-boat escaped or whether Anderson's crew became one more data point in the most devastating anti-submarine campaign in naval history. A campaign that would sink 41 U-boats in 1 month alone. A campaign that would force Admiral Karl Dönitz to withdraw his entire submarine fleet from the North Atlantic. A campaign built on a simple but revolutionary idea that had taken 3 years to discover. Stop flying high. Stop dropping charges from safe altitudes where accuracy was impossible. Instead, come down to 50 feet above the waves and release at the exact moment when the submarine was still visible in the water. 50 feet, close enough to see the spray hitting your windscreen, close enough to feel the bomber shudder in the turbulence off the ocean surface, close enough that one mistake, one moment of distraction, one mechanical failure would put you into the water at 180 knots when nobody would survive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem was that for 3 years, Allied aircraft had been attacking U-boats from altitudes that made accurate bombing nearly impossible, and nobody had realized it until American and British scientists started studying the mathematics of what was actually happening. In 1940, when the Battle of the Atlantic began in earnest, Royal Air Force Coastal Command flew anti-submarine patrols using short Sunderland flying boats, Armstrong Whitworth Whitleys and Lockheed Hudsons. The doctrine was straightforward. Patrol assigned areas. Search for submarines. When you found one, attack it with depth charges. The depth charges were modified versions of the same weapons used by surface ships. Mark 7 depth charges carried 200 pounds of amatol explosive. They were heavy cylindrical weapons, designed to be rolled off the stern of destroyers and corvettes. Adapting them for aircraft use meant adding fins for stabilization and fuses that could be set before takeoff. The standard attack procedure in 1940 and 1941 called for aircraft to approach the submarine at altitudes between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. This seemed sensible. Higher altitude meant better visibility. The crew could see the submarine from farther away. They could plan their attack approach. They had time to set up the bombing run. Higher altitude also meant safety from the submarine's anti-aircraft guns. German U-boats typically carried a 20mm cannon on the conning tower. Some carried additional machine guns. Flying at 1,500 feet put the aircraft beyond effective range of these weapons. The aircraft would approach the submarine, usually from the stern or the beam, to present a difficult target for the U-boat's gunners. At a predetermined release point, typically when the submarine was visible through a crude bomb site or when the pilot judged the geometry correct, the bombardier would release 4 to 6 depth charges. The charges would fall away from the aircraft, arcing through the air and splash into the ocean in a pattern around where the submarine had been. The statistics revealed the problem. In 1940, Royal Air Force Coastal Command made 217 attacks on U-boats. Confirmed kills totaled 6 submarines. That represented a kill rate of approximately 2.7%. In 1941, the statistics barely improved. 351 attacks resulted in 12 confirmed kills, 3.4%. The mathematics were devastating. For every 100 times an Allied aircraft found a U-boat and dropped bombs on it, 96 to 97 U-boats escaped. They survived to attack another convoy, sink another merchant ship, deliver another load of supplies to German troops in North Africa. The problem was accuracy. Dropping a depth charge from 1,500 feet meant the charge spent approximately 6 to 7 seconds falling through the air. During those 6 to 7 seconds, multiple factors combined to scatter the charges across a wide area. Wind at altitude pushed the charges off course. The aircraft's forward velocity added horizontal momentum. The submarine's wake created visual deception about its actual position. By the time the charges hit the water, they were landing 50 to 100 feet from where the crew thought the submarine was. But that was only the beginning of the problem. After the charges entered the water, they sank at rates between 8 and 16 feet per second, depending on the model. The fuses were typically set to detonate at 25 feet depth. That depth setting was based on assumptions about how deep a surface submarine would be when the charges arrived. A surfaced U-boat had a draft of about 15 feet. Add another 10 feet for the conning tower that rose above the water, and theoretically a depth charge exploding at 25 feet would be close enough to the submarine's pressure hull to cause catastrophic damage. But German submarines could crash dive incredibly quickly. From the moment the commander gave the order to dive, a Type 7C U-boat could be completely submerged in 30 seconds. In another 30 seconds, it could reach 100 feet depth. The German crews trained relentlessly for this maneuver. Every man had a specific station. Lookouts dropped through the conning tower hatch. The deck gunners followed. The commander took one last look around and dropped down last, pulling the hatch shut behind him. Below decks, men were already opening valves to flood the forward ballast tanks. Water poured into the tanks through Kingston valves. The bow angled all down. The submarine dove at angles exceeding 30 degrees. By the time depth charges dropped from 1,500 feet, fell through the air, entered the water, and sank to 25 feet, more than 12 to 14 seconds had elapsed since release. During those 12 to 14 seconds, a crash-diving U-boat could move 50 to 80 feet horizontally and dive to 70 to 90 feet depth. The chances of a depth charge exploding within lethal radius of the submarine were minimal. Captain Thorvald Solberg understood this. He was a United States Navy officer attached to the office of the Naval Attaché in London in 1942. His job involved coordinating American and British anti-submarine efforts and analyzing why those efforts were failing so spectacularly. Solberg assembled data from hundreds of attacks. He studied gun camera footage. He read after-action reports. He interviewed air crews who had survived being shot down by U-boats. He examined wreckage from submarines that had been sunk. He talked to scientists at the Admiralty research facilities and at American development groups. The conclusion became undeniable. Aircraft were attacking from too high. They were releasing too early. They were giving submarines too much warning and too much time to dive. The solution seemed obvious. Attack from lower altitude. The problem was how low was low enough. In December 1942, Solberg recruited an American economist named Stephen Rauschenbusch. Rauschenbusch had no military training beyond serving as an ambulance driver in World War I. He had spent the 1930s as an economist working on power generation and resource planning. He had degrees from Amherst College and Columbia University. He had never seen a submarine. He had certainly never flown on an anti-submarine patrol. But Rauschenbusch understood numbers. He understood statistics. He understood how to build mathematical models of complex systems. Solberg gave him one assignment: calculate the optimal altitude for anti-submarine attacks, determine how low aircraft needed to fly to maximize kill probability. Rauschenbusch went to Scotland to examine a captured German submarine. U-57T had surrendered to a British Hudson in August 1941 after being caught on the surface south of Iceland. The British had renamed it HMS Graf and were using it for training and testing. Rauschenbusch spent days crawling through the submarine, measuring dimensions, timing how long it took to operate valves, calculating ballast tank capacity. He interviewed German prisoners who had served on U-boats. He studied intelligence reports about submarine construction. He learned that a Type 7C could remain submerged for 36 to 41 hours before exhausting its air supply and battery charge. He learned that recharging the batteries required running diesel engines on the surface for at least 7 hours. He learned that if a submarine was forced to crash dive by an aircraft, it would need to surface again within minutes to recharge the batteries it had just drained during the emergency dive. Then, Rauschenbusch built his mathematical model. He started with known variables. A Type 7C U-boat took 30 seconds to submerge completely from the moment the commander gave the dive order. It could reach 100 feet depth in approximately 1 minute. A depth charge set to explode at 25 feet had a lethal radius of approximately 20 feet against a submarine pressure hull. That meant a charge needed to explode within 20 feet of the submarine to guarantee a kill. 30 to 40 feet would cause severe damage. Beyond 60 feet, damage would be minor and survivable. The mathematics showed that attacking from 1,500 feet gave the submarine 14 seconds from depth charge release to detonation, and that was enough time to dive to 70 or 80 feet, well below the 25-foot fuse setting. But what if aircraft attacked from 300 feet? Full time would drop to approximately 4 seconds. Total time from release to detonation would be 6 to 7 seconds. The submarine might reach 40 feet depth. The charges would be much more likely to explode within lethal range. But 300 feet was still not optimal. The submarine would still have 6 to 7 seconds warning from the moment the charges hit the water. Rauschenbusch calculated that the ideal altitude was as low as physically possible, 50 to 100 feet above the water. At that altitude, fall time would be under 2 seconds. Total time from release to detonation would be 3 to 4 seconds. The submarine would barely begin its dive before the charges exploded. The commander would still be pulling the hatch shut. The ballast tanks would just start flooding. The submarine would be at maybe 10 to 20 feet depth, practically sitting on the surface, exactly where a depth charge fuse set to 25 feet would detonate with maximum effect. The problem with flying at 50 feet was that it was completely insane by the standards of 1942 aviation. Heavy bombers like the Consolidated B-24 Liberator or the Short Sunderland were designed for high-altitude operations. They were large aircraft, not fighter planes. They weighed 30,000 pounds, fully loaded. They lacked the maneuverability for low-level flight over the ocean. The ocean surface at 50 feet was terrifying. Waves could reach 20 or 30 feet during storms. Swells created optical illusions that made judging altitude nearly impossible. A moment of inattention, a downdraft, a miscalculation, and the aircraft would hit the water at 170 knots. Nobody would survive. Moreover, standard barometric altimeters were useless at low altitudes over water. Barometric altimeters measured air pressure and converted that pressure reading to altitude above sea level. They were accurate enough at 5,000 or 10,000 feet. At 50 feet, variations in atmospheric pressure from weather systems could cause errors of 50 to 100 feet. An altimeter reading 50 feet might mean the aircraft was actually at 100 feet or actually at 0 feet, about to hit the ocean. Pilots had no way to know which. The solution came from American scientists at the 1st Sea Search Attack Group at Langley Field, Virginia. They developed what they called an absolute altimeter, It used modified microwave radar pointed straight down. The radar transmitted pulses and measured the time it took for those pulses to bounce off the ocean surface and return. The electronics converted that time measurement into altitude above the surface, accurate to within 10 feet regardless of atmospheric pressure or weather conditions. The absolute altimeter told the pilot exactly how high he was above the water he could see below his aircraft. With an absolute altimeter, a pilot could fly at 50 feet safely. Without it, flying at 50 feet was suicide. The absolute altimeter became standard equipment on American anti-submarine aircraft by early 1943. British aircraft received similar equipment. Royal Air Force Coastal Command began installing the new altimeters in their Sunderlands, Wellingtons, and Liberators during January and February 1943. Simultaneously, British and American engineers redesigned depth charges specifically for low-altitude attacks. The new charges had blunt noses and additional ballast weight that made them sink faster and more predictably. The Mark 9 depth charge carried 200 pounds of Torpex explosive. Torpex was a British-developed compound that was 50% more powerful than TNT. The charges were designed to hit the water nose first and sink at 14.5 feet per second. Fuses could be set for depths as shallow as 25 feet. When these new depth charges were dropped from 50 feet altitude, they would detonate within 3 to 4 seconds of release, giving submarines virtually no time to escape. By February 1943, the pieces were in place. Aircraft equipped with absolute altimeters, crews trained in low-altitude attack techniques, new depth charges optimized for shallow water detonation, improved ASV Mark Three radar that could detect surfaced submarines from 40 miles away using 10-centimeter wavelength that German Metox radar detectors could not sense. The Bay of Biscay became the testing ground. The Bay of Biscay was a body of water approximately 300 miles wide, separating the western coast of France from the northern coast of Spain. Every German U-boat based at the French Atlantic ports had to cross this bay twice on every combat patrol, once outbound heading to the hunting grounds in the North Atlantic, once inbound returning from patrol. The submarines were vulnerable during both transits because they needed to travel on the surface to make decent speed and recharge batteries. German U-boat command knew the bay was dangerous. Submarines crossed at night when possible. They hugged the Spanish coast where fishing boats provided concealment. They posted extra lookouts. They mounted additional anti-aircraft weapons. Some submarines carried 4 20-millimeter cannons plus a 37-millimeter gun, transforming them into floating anti-aircraft platforms. Admiral Karl Dönitz had even issued orders in May 1943 telling submarine commanders to remain on the surface and fight back against attacking aircraft rather than diving. 4 U-boats had been specially converted into flak boats, heavily armed anti-aircraft submarines designed to lure Allied planes into traps. But none of these measures could counter the fundamental problem. Aircraft flying at 50 feet above the water with absolute altimeters and improved depth charges were killing submarines faster than German shipyards could replace them. The offensive began in earnest in April 1943. Royal Air Force No. 19 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Geoffrey Bromet, controlled operations over the Bay of Biscay. The group flew B-24 Liberators, Short Sunderlands, Handley Page Halifaxes, and Vickers Wellingtons. American aircraft joined the offensive. The United States Army Air Forces, 1st Anti-Submarine Group, flew B-24s, equipped with ASV Mark Three radar and trained in the new low-altitude tactics. United States Navy patrol squadrons operated PB4Y Liberators from bases in England and Morocco. The aircraft flew continuous patrols, round-the-clock coverage. Daytime patrols used the big 4-engine bombers. Wellingtons equipped with Lee lights flew night patrols. The Lee light was a modified searchlight that could illuminate a submarine from a distance of 1 mile, giving night flying crews the ability to see their target during the critical final seconds of an attack run. Aircraft departed at 30-minute intervals, creating an overlapping coverage pattern across the entire bay. If a submarine surfaced anywhere in the patrol area, the chances of being spotted were high. If it was spotted, the chances of being killed had just increased dramatically. On May 7, 1943, Wing Commander Wilfred Alton of No. 58 Squadron RAF was flying a Halifax on patrol over the Bay of Biscay. His radar operator picked up a contact, surfaced submarine. Alton closed in and identified it as U-663. He maneuvered into attack position, descended to 100 feet, and released 6 depth charges. The charges straddled the submarine. Explosions erupted around the U-boat's hull. U-663 lost power and wallowed in the swells. Alton circled and watched as the crew abandoned ship. The submarine sank, stern first. All hands were lost. 8 days later, on May 15th, Alton found another target, U-463, a Type 14 supply submarine. These boats were called Milchkuher, milk cows, because they refueled and resupplied combat submarines at sea. They were priority targets. Alton attacked from 200 feet, releasing his entire load of depth charges. The submarine exploded and sank within minutes. Alton would sink a third U-boat, U-564, before the month ended. 3 submarines destroyed by 1 squadron commander in 3 weeks. It was unprecedented. May 1943 became known as Black May in the German U-boat service. 41 U-boats were sunk that month across all theaters of operations. 18 were sunk in convoy battles in the North Atlantic. 14 were sunk by air patrols. 6 of those 14 were killed in the Bay of Biscay alone. The statistics represented a catastrophe for the Kriegsmarine. German shipyards were producing approximately 20 U-boats per month. Losing 41 in a single month meant losses exceeded production by more than double. The U-boat fleet was shrinking. At that rate of attrition, the submarine force would cease to exist within a year. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Karl Dönitz sent message 1769 to all U-boat commanders on May 17th, 1943. The message was blunt. The situation in the North Atlantic now forces a temporary shift of operations to areas less endangered by aircraft. Dönitz was admitting defeat. For the first time in the war, German submarines were withdrawing from the primary battleground because Allied aircraft had made operations unsustainable. The submarines were ordered to scatter to less dangerous areas: South Atlantic, Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, anywhere except the convoy routes between North America and Britain, where the aircraft were most concentrated. But the aircraft followed. The Bay of Biscay offensive intensified. Between April and August 1943, 26 U-boats were sunk by air attack in the bay. 17 more were damaged, forced to return to port for repairs. 1 U-boat out of every 6 that attempted to cross the bay in those 4 months never made it to the Atlantic. The survivors limped back to base with dead crewmen, damaged equipment, depleted morale. The numbers revealed the transformation. In 1940 and 1941, when aircraft attacked from 1,500 feet, the kill rate was 3%. In 1943, when aircraft attacked from 50 to 100 feet, the kill rate approached 18 to 20%. That represented a 6-fold improvement. Same aircraft, same basic weapons, different altitude. The difference was the time between depth charge release and detonation. At 50 feet, submarines had no time to dive. The charges exploded while the submarine was still practically on the surface, within lethal range of the weapons. The psychological impact on German submarine crews was devastating. U-boat service had always been dangerous. Submariners knew the statistics. 1 in 3 would not survive the war, but at least in earlier years, they had felt they could fight back. A skillful commander who heard an aircraft approaching could crash dive and escape. Anti-aircraft guns could drive off attackers. Evasive maneuvers could throw off the aim of bombs dropped from high altitude. By mid-1943, those defensive options had vanished. Aircraft appeared without warning, guided by radar that German METOX detectors could not sense. They attacked from altitudes so low that crash diving was useless. The depth charges exploded before the submarine could get 20 feet underwater. There was no effective defense. U-boat crews started calling the Bay of Biscay the Valley of Death. Some commanders requested transfer to other duties rather than face another transit. German naval headquarters received reports of falling morale, increased sickness, reluctance to put to sea. The human cost manifested in personal tragedies. On May 12, 1943, U-954 was sunk by aircraft and surface ships while attacking convoy SC-130. Among the dead was Lieutenant Zurzay Peter Dönitz, son of Admiral Karl Dönitz. The admiral received notification that his son was missing and presumed dead. He continued directing submarine operations without public comment. Later investigations confirmed Peter Dönitz died when his submarine was sunk. The admiral never discussed the loss publicly. He simply continued sending other men's sons into the Bay of Biscay, where aircraft were waiting at 50 feet altitude with improved depth charges. The tactical changes extended beyond just flying lower. Aircraft crews developed new attack techniques specifically optimized for low-altitude operations. The standard approach became a high-speed run directly toward the submarine at 50 to 100 feet altitude. Airspeed would be 170 to 200 knots. The pilot would aim directly at the submarine's hull using the gun sight as a reference point. At a distance of approximately 300 to 400 yards, typically about 6 to 8 seconds flying time, the bombardier would release the depth charges. The charges would arc slightly downward from the aircraft's momentum and splash into the water in a pattern that straddled the submarine's position. The timing was critical. Released too early and the charges would undershoot, exploding behind the submarine. Released too late and the charges would overshoot. The sweet spot was that 6 to 8 second window where the charges would hit the water close enough to the submarine that their 25-foot fuse settings would detonate within lethal range. Experienced bombardiers learned to judge that timing instinctively. They watched the submarine grow larger in their vision. They compensated for wind and aircraft drift. They released at the exact moment when their experience said the geometry was correct. Gun camera footage from successful attacks shows submarines practically disappearing inside the eruption of water and explosive debris. The charges would hit in a line, extending from just ahead of the conning tower to just behind it, 4 to 6 simultaneous explosions. Water would fountain up 200 feet. When the spray settled, the submarine would be gone. Sometimes, debris would appear. Wood fragments, cork insulation, oil slicks, sometimes nothing. The submarine would just vanish. Unsuccessful attacks were equally dramatic. If the charges missed, nothing happened. No explosions. Just 6 splashes as the charges entered the water and sank to the bottom. The submarine would continue on course, often increasing speed, trying to build distance before the aircraft could turn around for another attack. The crew aboard the aircraft would watch the submarine pull away, knowing they had seconds to decide whether to pursue or to break off and search for another target. The improved depth charges with contact fuses meant immediate feedback. Silence meant miss. Explosions meant hit. There was no ambiguity. The German response evolved throughout 1943. In May, Dönitz issued his famous fight-back order. Submarines were instructed to remain on the surface and engage attacking aircraft with all available anti-aircraft weapons. The theory was the German crews could inflict enough damage on Allied aircraft to deter attacks or at least disrupt bombing accuracy. Between May and August 1943, U-boats shot down 32 Allied aircraft. The victories included large 4-engine bombers like B-24 Liberators, Halifaxes, and Sunderlands. Some were twin-engine aircraft. One was even a blimp, K-74, shot down over the Florida Straits while attacking U-134. But the cost was unsustainable. Those 32 aircraft shot down had required exposing submarines to hundreds of attacks. In return, 26 U-boats were sunk by aircraft in the same period, with 17 more heavily damaged. The mathematics favored the Allies overwhelmingly. A 4-engine B-24 Liberator cost approximately $297,000 to build. A Type 7C U-boat cost Germany $2.25 million. Even if the Germans shot down 4 bombers for every submarine lost, they were losing economically, and they were not achieving even that exchange rate. The actual ratio was closer to 1 aircraft shot down for every 1 submarine sunk. More importantly, crew losses favored the Allies. A B-24 carried a crew of 8 to 10 men. A U-boat carried 44 to 50. Every submarine sunk meant 40 to 50 trained submariners dead. Germany could not replace those men quickly enough. Training a submarine crew to operational competence took months. Building a new submarine took nearly a year. Allied aircraft and air crews could be replaced in weeks. By August 1943, Dönitz quietly rescinded the fight-back order. Submarines resumed diving when aircraft approached, but diving was no longer an effective defense because aircraft were attacking from altitudes that gave submarines no time to reach safe depth. The only remaining option was to avoid detection entirely. Submarines began crossing the bay, submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries. This slowed their transit time from 18 hours to 3 or 4 days. It meant submarines spent less time on patrol station and more time in transit. It reduced the number of submarines that could be kept in operational areas. The Bay of Biscay offensive had achieved its strategic objective. German submarine effectiveness was declining not because submarines were being sunk in convoy battles, but because the submarines could barely reach the convoy routes. The statistical analysis proved the impact. In March 1943, before the low-altitude offensive reached full intensity, U-boats sank 120 Allied merchant ships, totaling nearly 700,000 gross tons worldwide. In May, during Black May, total Allied losses dropped to 58 ships of 299,000 tons. Only 34 of those ships totaling 134,000 tons were lost in the Atlantic. By August, when the Bay of Biscay offensive was peaking, U-boat sinkings had fallen to negligible levels in the North Atlantic convoy lanes. Some convoys crossed the Atlantic without seeing a single submarine. Of those convoys that were attacked, Allied escorts and aircraft were sinking U-boats faster than the U-boats were sinking merchant ships. Prime Minister Winston Churchill noted in September 1943 that between May 1st and September 15th, not a single Allied merchant ship had been sunk by U-boats on North Atlantic convoy routes. The statement was slight exaggeration. There had been a handful of losses, but it reflected the dramatic reversal of fortunes. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had threatened to strangle Britain and force a negotiated peace, had been won. Aircraft flying at 50 feet above the Bay of Biscay with absolute altimeters and improved depth charges had broken the back of the U-boat offensive. The technology and tactics continued evolving. By late 1943, some aircraft carried acoustic homing torpedoes. The Mark 24 mine, codenamed Fido, was actually a small torpedo that homed on the sound of submarine propellers. When dropped near a diving submarine, it would activate and pursue the target underwater. Fido was particularly effective against submarines that had managed to dive before depth charges detonated. The acoustic torpedoes added another layer to the threat environment. U-boats that survived the depth charge, attacked by diving quickly, might still be killed by a homing torpedo that followed them down. German countermeasures appeared, but proved insufficient. The schnorkel breathing tube allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. Air entered through a tube that projected above the surface. Exhaust vented through a second tube. Submarines equipped with schnorkels could theoretically remain submerged indefinitely, crossing the bay without ever surfacing. But schnorkels had serious limitations. The tubes created a wake that alert lookouts could spot. The smoke from diesel exhaust was visible from miles away. ASV Mark Three radar could detect the schnorkel mast, and remaining submerged for days at a time created tremendous physical and psychological stress on crews. The atmospheric pressure inside the submarine varied as waves covered and uncovered the air intake. Crew members suffered from headaches, nausea, exhaustion. Some commanders reported that after 3 or 4 days running on schnorkel, their crews were barely functional. By late 1943, the United States Navy contributed escort carrier groups to the anti-submarine campaign. Escort carriers were small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls. They carried 20 to 30 aircraft. typically a mix of Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The carriers operated in hunter-killer groups, supported by destroyers and destroyer escorts. When intelligence indicated U-boat activity in a specific area, the carrier group would steam to that location and launch continuous air patrols. The carrier-based aircraft employed the same low-altitude attack tactics developed over the Bay of Biscay. TBF Avengers would descend to 50 feet above the water and release depth charges or torpedoes. The fighters would strafe the submarine with 50 caliber machine guns, killing deck crews and forcing the submarine to dive into the depth charges. The coordination between fighters and bombers proved devastatingly effective. During mid-1943, escort carrier groups operating in the Atlantic sank 17 U-boats. The USS Card alone accounted for 5 submarines destroyed in August. The success rate for carrier-based attacks approached 40%, significantly higher than land-based aircraft, because the carriers could position themselves close to known U-boat operating areas and maintain continuous coverage. The human stories behind the statistics revealed both courage and tragedy on all sides. Flight Lieutenant Dudley Marrows of No. 10 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force was flying a Sunderland on patrol over the Bay of Biscay on June 2, 1943, when he encountered a remarkable situation. 8 Junkers 88 fighters attacked his aircraft. The Sunderland, although large and relatively slow, was heavily armed with multiple gun turrets. Marrows and his crew fought a running battle at low altitude over the ocean. The Sunderland shot down 3 German fighters. 2 more were damaged. The remaining 3 broke off the attack. Marrows brought his badly damaged aircraft back to base with 2 wounded crew members. The engagement demonstrated that even large patrol aircraft could defend themselves effectively when crews were properly trained and equipped. But not all encounters ended successfully for Allied aircrew. Flying Officer Kenneth Moore of No. 53 Squadron RAF was killed on July 21, 1943, when his Liberator was shot down by U-558. The submarine's anti-aircraft fire hit the bomber's fuel tanks. The aircraft exploded in mid-air. There were no survivors. Moore was 23 years old. His crew ranged in age from 19 to 28. All 10 men died. U-558 survived the encounter, but was sunk 3 months later by a British frigate after being crippled by aircraft depth charges. The psychological toll on aircrew was substantial but different from the stress experienced by bomber crews flying over Germany. Anti-submarine patrols were long, typically 8 to 12 hours. The aircraft droned over endless ocean. Nothing happened for hours. Then suddenly a contact would appear, and within minutes the crew would be attacking at 50 feet altitude, with anti-aircraft fire erupting around them, making split-second decisions that meant life or death for both sides. The transition from boredom to terror could happen in seconds. Some crew members developed severe air sickness from the low-altitude turbulence. Medical officers occasionally flew on patrols to study the effects on crew health. They documented that fatigue, air sickness, and stress degraded crew performance significantly after 6 hours of patrol. But operational requirements often demanded longer missions. The Bay of Biscay became one of the most dangerous airspaces in the war for both sides. German Ju-88 fighters based at airfields along the French coast flew combat air patrols attempting to intercept Allied bombers. British bow fighters equipped with long-range fuel tanks flew fighter sweeps to engage the German fighters and protect the patrol aircraft. Aerial combat at low altitude over the ocean was chaotic and deadly. Aircraft damaged by gunfire often could not reach friendly territory. They ditched in the bay, where survival chances in the cold water were minimal. Air-sea rescue operations by Catalina flying boats and surface vessels saved some crews, but many were simply listed as missing, presumed killed in action. The logistical support for the Bay offensive was enormous. No. 19 Group maintained continuous patrols across an area of approximately 50,000 square miles. Aircraft required constant maintenance. Radar sets were notoriously unreliable and needed frequent adjustment. Engines logged hundreds of hours and required replacement. Depth charges had to be loaded, fuses set, safety wires installed. Each Liberator carried 6 to 8 depth charges. Each Sunderland carried 6. A squadron of 12 aircraft flying daily patrols would expend 75 to 100 depth charges per day when contacts were frequent. Supply lines delivered thousands of depth charges to bases throughout Cornwall, Devon, and Scotland. The weather over the bay was consistently challenging. Atlantic storms could appear with little warning. Visibility could drop to near zero in minutes as fog banks rolled in. Aircraft returning to base, low on fuel, sometimes could not land because weather had closed the airfield. They would divert to alternate bases or ditch in the ocean if fuel ran out. Winter operations were particularly brutal. Temperatures inside unheated bombers at altitude dropped below freezing. Crews wore electrically heated suits, but still suffered from cold-related injuries. Ice could form on wings and control surfaces, degrading flight characteristics and sometimes causing crashes. The German perspective on the Bay offensive revealed institutional dysfunction and strategic confusion. German naval headquarters understood that submarines were being killed at unsustainable rates, but disagreed about solutions. Some officers argued for equipping submarines with better anti-aircraft weapons. This led to the flak boat conversions, which proved ineffective. The heavily armed submarines were slower and less maneuverable than standard boats. They made inviting targets. 3 of the 4 flak boats were sunk within months. U-441 survived only because it was so badly damaged in combat that it returned to port and was reassigned to training duties. Other German officers argued for developing countermeasures against Allied radar. German scientists attempted to build a centimetric wavelength radar detector that could sense ASV Mark Three emissions. They succeeded in developing the Naxos detector, which became available in late 1943, but by then, submarines were already avoiding surface transit during daylight hours. The Naxos detector provided warning, but no solution. A submarine that detected radar emissions still had to dive, which meant slow progress across the bay and reduced time on patrol station. The fundamental problem was that Germany lacked the industrial capacity and scientific infrastructure to compete with Allied technological development. British scientists at establishments like the Telecommunications Research Establishment and American scientists at places like the Radiation Laboratory at MIT worked on radar improvements continuously. Every few months, they produced enhanced equipment with better range, better resolution, better reliability. German scientists were talented, but worked with fewer resources, less coordination between military and civilian research institutions, and constant interference from Nazi Party officials who demanded immediate results rather than sustained development programs. The Luftwaffe's failure to protect the Bay of Biscay remains one of the notable puzzles of the air war. German airfields at Bordeaux, Brest, and Kurlan-Bastard were within easy range of the bay. Germany had hundreds of fighters stationed in France, yet Allied aircraft flew patrols over the bay with relative impunity for months. German fighters appeared occasionally, but never in sufficient numbers to seriously disrupt operations. Part of the explanation involves competing priorities. The Luftwaffe was heavily engaged in defending Germany against strategic bombing, fighting in the Mediterranean, and supporting ground operations on the Eastern Front. Resources were stretched thin. Coastal defense received low priority, but there was also a coordination failure between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe. The two services maintained separate command structures and rarely cooperated effectively. U-boat command would request air cover for submarines transiting the bay. The Luftwaffe would promise support but failed to deliver adequate forces. Submarines would report being attacked by Allied aircraft while German fighters were nowhere to be seen. Recriminations flew back and forth between headquarters. Nothing improved. The structural problems extended to German submarine construction and deployment decisions. By mid-1943, Admiral Dönitz knew the Type 7 U-boat was increasingly obsolete. New submarine designs were under development. The Type 21 was a revolutionary design with a streamlined hull that could reach 17 knots submerged, faster than most Allied convoy escorts. It used new battery technology that extended underwater endurance to several days. Equipped with schnorkels, Type 21 boats could theoretically remain submerged for entire patrols, surfacing only when entering or leaving port. But the Type 21 would not be ready for operational service until late 1944 at the earliest. In the meantime, Dönitz had to continue sending Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats on patrols where losses exceeded replacement rates. He knew the mathematics did not work. He knew his force was shrinking. He had no choice. Germany needed submarines operating in the Atlantic to tie down Allied resources, to threaten supply lines, to maintain at least the appearance of fighting back. The alternative was to abandon the Atlantic entirely, which would free enormous Allied naval and air resources for use elsewhere, possibly accelerating Germany's defeat. So the submarines kept sailing. Young crews, average age 22, would board their boats at Lorient or Saint-Nazaire. They would cast off from the concrete pens and head into the bay, knowing that statistically 1 boat in 6 would not return. They would run on the surface at night, hoping to avoid detection. If aircraft appeared, they would dive and pray the depth charges missed. If they survived the outbound transit, they would patrol for weeks in the North Atlantic, searching for convoys that were increasingly well defended. Then they would face the inbound transit across the bay, exhausted, low on fuel and torpedoes, hoping their luck held one more time. The crews that survived developed superstitions. Some commanders insisted on specific routines before sailing. Others carried talismans or lucky items. Some boats were considered lucky ships, while others were seen as cursed. These beliefs had no rational basis, but provided psychological comfort in situations where rational analysis offered no hope. The men knew the odds. They went anyway, because orders demanded it, because comrades depended on them, because the alternative was courts-martial or worse. The German military justice system treated reluctance to fight as cowardice. Men who refused combat assignments could be shot. By December 1943, the Bay of Biscay had become so dangerous that German submarine commanders were reporting it was safer to patrol in the North Atlantic, where Allied defenses were heavy, than to transit the bay. That represented a complete reversal of the strategic situation from 2 years earlier. The concrete submarine pens at the French ports, which had been built to protect submarines and facilitate rapid turnaround between patrols, had become traps. Submarines sheltered inside but could barely leave. Those that did venture out faced a gauntlet that claimed a horrifying percentage. The climax of the Bay offensive came during Operation Musketry in June 1943, and its follow-up operations, Sea Slug and Percussion, through September. These operations involved coordinated patrols by up to 260 aircraft over carefully planned patrol areas. Intelligence from ultra-decrypts of German Enigma messages provided information about U-boat movements. Allied operational planners used this intelligence to position aircraft where submarines were most likely to appear. The combination of signals intelligence, continuous air coverage, low-altitude attack tactics, and improved weapons created a killing zone that U-boats could barely penetrate. During the summer operations, 27 U-boats were sunk in the Bay area between June and August. 24 of those kills were achieved by aircraft. Another dozen submarines were damaged badly enough to require extended repairs. The survivors reported that transiting the bay had become nearly suicidal. Submarines were being spotted by radar before they could see the attacking aircraft. Attacks came from altitudes so low that crash diving was useless. Multiple aircraft would often attack in succession, preventing the submarine from surfacing to recharge batteries or repair damage. Some boats spent days submerged, running on schnorkels with crews near collapse from exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning, only to be caught on the surface when they finally had to surface for fresh air. The night of November the 12th, 1943, when Lieutenant William Anderson's Liberator, Calvert and Coke, transmitted its final position and then disappeared, illustrated both the success and the cost of the campaign. The Liberator had detected a U-boat on radar at 3:17 in the morning. Anderson had descended to attack. The submarine had been U-508, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Georg Statz. U-508 had been attempting to cross the bay inbound after a patrol in the South Atlantic, Staats had spotted the approaching Liberator against the stars and had ordered his gunners to open fire while simultaneously beginning emergency maneuvers. What happened next would not be fully understood until years later, when German records were examined and compared with American loss reports. The evidence suggests that Anderson attacked from approximately 100 feet of altitude, lower than optimal, but within acceptable parameters. He released depth charges. U-508's anti-aircraft fire hit the Liberator simultaneously. Multiple 20mm shells struck the bomber's wings and fuselage. One engine caught fire. The depth charges exploded around U-508. The submarine was severely damaged. Its pressure hull ruptured in multiple places. Water flooded into the forward torpedo room and the control room. The Liberator tried to climb away, but the damaged engine failed completely. With one engine out and another engine losing power, Anderson could not maintain altitude. The bomber descended toward the ocean. He transmitted one final radio message reporting the attack. Then contact was lost. The Liberator hit the water at approximately 130 knots. The impact killed most of the crew instantly. The aircraft sank within seconds. There were no survivors. U-508 remained on the surface, flooding uncontrollably. Staats ordered abandon ship. The crew inflated life rafts and evacuated. The submarine sank 15 minutes later. 46 of the 51 crew members were rescued by Spanish fishing boats and interned in Spain. 5 men died from their injuries. Anderson and his entire crew of 10 men were killed. The engagement resulted in both aircraft and submarine destroyed. Tactically, it was a draw. Strategically, it represented Allied success. Germany had lost a submarine and 46 trained submariners removed from combat, even if they survived in internment. America had lost 1 bomber and 10 aircrew. American industry could replace the bomber in weeks. Training commands could replace the crew in months. Germany could build a new submarine in a year, but could not replace the experienced submariners at all. The veteran submariners interned in Spain were effectively removed from the war permanently. They could not be repatriated without Spain abandoning neutrality. The exchange rate favored the Allies. By January 1944, the character of the Bay of Biscay offensive had changed. U-boat traffic across the bay had declined to perhaps 20 to 30 transits per month compared to 100 or more per month in early 1943. The submarines that still operated had adapted. Most crossed submerged on schnorkels during daylight. Some hugged the Spanish coast within territorial waters where Allied aircraft were reluctant to attack for fear of diplomatic incidents. A few attempted to cross on the surface at night during storms when weather grounded aircraft. The casualties continued, but at lower rates, simply because fewer submarines were attempting the crossing. Allied aircraft shifted focus to other areas. Some squadrons redeployed to the Mediterranean to support the Italian campaign and preparations for the Normandy invasion. Others moved to Iceland and the Azores to close the mid-Atlantic air gap completely. 19 Group continued bay patrols, but with reduced intensity. The objective had been achieved. The Bay of Biscay was no longer a safe transit route for U-boats. German submarine operations from French bases had been throttled to a fraction of their former intensity. The final chapter of the bay story came in August 1944. Allied armies advancing from Normandy reached the French Atlantic coast. German forces began evacuating the submarine bases. Every U-boat that could still operate made one last dash across the bay, attempting to reach German or Norwegian ports before being trapped. Aircraft intercepted many of them. Some surrendered, others were scuttled by their crews. The concrete pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle and Bordeaux were blown up or simply abandoned. The infrastructure that had supported hundreds of U-boats for 4 years was demolished or fell into Allied hands. The statistical summary of the Bay of Biscay offensive revealed its impact on the broader war. Between January 1943 and August 1944, 69 U-boats were sunk in the Bay area. Approximately 55 of those kills were achieved by aircraft. Another 30 to 40 submarines were damaged badly enough to require major repairs that kept them out of service for months. The Bay offensive directly removed approximately 100 submarines from German operational strength, either through sinking, or through damage that required extended repairs. That represented roughly 20% of Germany's total U-boat losses during that period. More importantly, the Bay Offensive that forced changes in German submarine operations that reduced effectiveness across the entire Atlantic theater. Submarines that spent extra days crossing the bay submerged on schnorkels had less time on patrol station. Submarines that avoided the bay by sailing north around Scotland added thousands of miles to their deployment distances, consuming fuel that could have been used for patrol operations. Submarines that were diverted to bases in Norway operated farther from the critical North Atlantic convoy routes. The indirect effects of the Bay Offensive arguably exceeded the direct losses. The fundamental lesson of the Bay of Biscay campaign was that altitude mattered. For 3 years, Allied aircraft had attacked U-boats from 1,500 feet and achieved kill rates around 3%. In 1943, when aircraft began attacking from 50 feet, kill rates increased to 18 to 20%. The difference was time. At 1,500 feet, submarines had 14 seconds from depth charge release to detonation. That was enough time to dive deep enough that charges exploded harmlessly. At 50 feet, submarines had 3 to 4 seconds. That was not enough time to dive even 20 feet. The charges exploded while the submarine was still essentially on the surface, within lethal range. The technology that enabled low-altitude attacks, the absolute altimeter, was not particularly sophisticated by the standards of World War II electronics. It was modified microwave radar pointed downward. The engineering was straightforward. What mattered was recognizing that the problem existed and that flying lower would solve it. For 3 years, nobody had questioned the doctrine of attacking from 1,500 feet. The doctrine seemed reasonable. Higher altitude meant better visibility and safety from anti-aircraft fire. Nobody had systematically analyzed how much time submarines had to react and whether that time was allowing them to escape. Stephen Rauschenbusch, the American economist with no military experience, had asked the question that should have been obvious, but was not. How low do you need to fly to kill submarines? He built a mathematical model. He calculated fall times and dive times. He determined that 50 feet was optimal. He presented his analysis in December 1942. By February 1943, aircraft were flying at 50 feet with absolute altimeters. By May 1943, U-boats were dying at 6 times the previous rate. The entire transformation from question to implementation took 5 months. The story illustrates how warfare depends on asking the right questions. German U-boats in 1943 were the same submarines that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. They had the same capabilities, the same tactics, the same experienced crews. Allied aircraft in 1943 were essentially the same aircraft that had achieved 3% kill rates in 1941. Same bombers, same basic weapons, same training pipeline. What changed was altitude and the technology to fly safely at that altitude. That single change transformed the campaign. The human cost of the transformation was measured in thousands of lives. Approximately 3,000 German submariners died in the Bay of Biscay between January 1943 and August 1944. They died in submarines that exploded when depth charges ruptured pressure hulls. They died drowning in cold water after abandoning sinking boats. They died from wounds inflicted by strafing fighters. Most were in their early 20s. Most had volunteered for submarine service because it offered better pay and more adventure than surface ship duty. Most never imagined they would die in the bay within sight of the French coast, killed by aircraft they never saw until the final seconds. Allied aircrew losses were significant, but proportionally smaller. Approximately 250 aircrew were killed in operations over the bay during the same period. They died in aircraft shot down by U-boat anti-aircraft fire. They died in crashes caused by mechanical failures or weather. They died when damaged bombers ditched in the ocean and broke apart on impact. The average age was similar to the German submariners, early 20s. Most were volunteers who had joined because they wanted to fly, not because they had carefully analyzed the statistical probability of survival in anti-submarine operations. The Coastal Command Memorial at Westminster Abbey in London lists the names of approximately 10,000 aircrew who died in anti-submarine and maritime patrol operations during World War II. The Bay of Biscay offensive accounts for a small fraction of that total, but those names represent men who died implementing the tactical innovation that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. They flew large, heavy bombers at 50 feet above the ocean, knowing that one mistake would kill them, because the mathematics said that was how you killed submarines. The technology developed for low-altitude anti-submarine warfare found applications beyond the Bay of Biscay. Absolute altimeters became standard equipment on all maritime patrol aircraft. The United States Navy continued using them through the Cold War for anti-submarine operations against Soviet submarines. The tactical principles learned from low-altitude attacks informed development of anti-submarine helicopters in the 1950s and 60s. Helicopters could hover at 50 feet indefinitely, providing even better positioning for depth charge or torpedo attacks. Modern maritime patrol aircraft still employ similar low-altitude approach tactics when attacking submarines with torpedoes or depth charges, though the weapons have become far more sophisticated. The Bay of Biscay itself became a quieter place after August 1944. The U-boat threat ended. Merchant ships crossed without submarine attacks. Fishing boats returned to their traditional grounds. The French ports that had hosted hundreds of U-boats rebuilt as commercial harbors. The concrete submarine pens remained, too massive to demolish easily, converted to other uses, or simply left to decay. Some became warehouses. Others became museums. Visitors today can walk through the pens and imagine submarines moored inside, crews preparing for patrol, knowing that crossing the bay meant running a gauntlet where one boat in 6 would not return. The veterans who survived carried memories they rarely discussed. German submariners who spent the last year of the war avoiding aircraft over the bay remembered the terror of hearing depth charges explode close enough to shake the hull, wondering if the next pattern would be the one that ruptured the pressure hull and flooded the boat. Allied aircrew remembered flying at 50 feet in darkness or storms, watching the altimeter, knowing that one error would kill everyone aboard, searching for the dim shape of a submarine that might or might not be there. Wing Commander Wilfred Alton, who had sunk 3 U-boats in May and June 1943, survived the war and remained in the Royal Air Force. He retired as an Air Commodore in 1962. He wrote articles about anti-submarine tactics for military journals, but rarely spoke publicly about specific attacks. When asked about the 3 submarines he had destroyed, he invariably gave credit to his crew and emphasized the team nature of anti-submarine warfare. He had never claimed to be a hero. He insisted he had simply done his job. Lieutenant Commander Werner Henke, who commanded U-515 and achieved some success against Allied convoys in early 1943, survived the Bay Gauntlet multiple times before his submarine was sunk by American destroyers in April 1944. Henke survived and was captured. He died in June 1944 while in a prisoner of war camp in the United States, shot while allegedly attempting escape. The circumstances remain controversial, with some accounts suggesting he was killed deliberately rather than while escaping. Stephen Rauschenbusch, the American economist whose mathematical analysis had led to the low-altitude attack doctrine, returned to the United States after the war and resumed civilian life. He worked for various government agencies and private organizations dealing with economic policy and resource management. He died in 1945, less than 2 years after completing his work on the Bay Offensive. He was 47 years old. The cause of death was not widely reported. His contribution to winning the Battle of the Atlantic was not publicly recognized during his lifetime because much of the technical details remained classified. Historians would later identify his analysis as one of the key insights that transformed anti-submarine warfare. Captain Thorvald Solberg, who had recruited Rauschenbusch and pushed for the low-altitude tactics, continued serving in various naval intelligence positions through the end of the war. He retired as a rear admiral and lived until 1973. In interviews late in life, he emphasized that the Bay offensive succeeded because multiple elements came together simultaneously. Intelligence from ultra-decrypts provided targeting information. Technology development provided absolute altimeters and improved depth charges. Tactical innovation provided the low-altitude attack doctrine. Operational planning provided sustained coverage over critical areas. Industrial capacity provided enough aircraft and weapons to maintain the offensive. Remove any one element, and the campaign would have failed. And thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.